Marcus Reed was the kind of man who had never needed to be cruel because he had never needed to be. Not with his fists, not with words sharpened into the obvious shapes of things that wound. His way of causing pain was quieter than that, and for that reason harder to name. It was indifference dressed up as pragmatism. It was contempt wearing the mask of common sense. It was the absolute certainty that the other person had nowhere else to go, and that this certainty gave him permission to take small liberties that would otherwise have been unthinkable. Marcus had been married to Renee Vaughn for 14 years, and in those 14 years he had come to believe with the solid, unquestioned weight of a man who has never had reason to doubt himself that Renee needed him too much to ever leave. It was not a thought he had ever put into words, because real arrogance rarely bothers with words. It is simply the air a person breathes, the invisible assumption sitting behind every choice he makes. The night he told her it was over, that there was someone else, that the marriage no longer made sense to continue, Marcus expected Renee to cry. He expected her to beg. Somewhere in the deepest part of himself, in the place where a person keeps the expectations he would never admit to having, he expected her to prove that he was still the center of her life, and that losing him would be a catastrophe she could never recover from. Renee listened to him from the armchair in the study, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight. When he finished speaking, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said 2 words. "Okay, that's fine." No tears, no pleading, none of the scene that he had been waiting for without ever admitting it to himself. Marcus looked at her. "That's all you have to say?" "For now." Renee stood up from the chair with the same straight posture she had been sitting in. "I'm going to bed. Tomorrow we can talk about next steps." She went to the bedroom and closed the door. Marcus sat alone in the study, surrounded by the echo of what he had just said, feeling for the first time that night something that was not relief, but an unease he couldn't put a name to. He did not know yet that what Renee had said fine wasn't resignation the way he had read it. It was the result of 9 quiet months of work. To understand Renee Vaughn, you have to understand where she came from. She had grown up in Asheville, North Carolina, the 4th of 5 children in a family where the money stretched exactly as far as it needed to, no further, and where problems got solved through work, not complaint, because complaining was a luxury nobody in that house could afford. Her mother, whom everyone called Miss Pearl, had worked as a seamstress for 30 years, first in a textile mill outside town, and later from home once the children came, on a sewing machine that was still running decades after she'd bought it secondhand, because things made with care last, and Miss Pearl always knew how to tell what would last from what wouldn't. Renee had studied accounting at the University of North Carolina, Asheville, and graduated with honors. At 24, she had moved to Atlanta with 2 suitcases and the address of a cousin who would rent her a room while she found work. She found a job in 3 weeks at a small accounting firm, and in 6 years she rose from junior clerk to senior accountant. She had met Marcus at a work dinner. He was an architect, ran his own small firm, and carried himself with an ease that struck Renee as elegant before she understood that Marcus's elegance depended almost entirely on someone else quietly handling the details that made it possible. They dated for 2 years and married in Atlanta in a ceremony Renee had planned almost entirely by herself because Marcus always said that kind of thing wasn't his strength. She accepted that explanation without asking herself too hard what it meant that her future husband couldn't be bothered to help plan his own wedding. The early years were good, or at least good enough that any friction could be written off as the normal growing pains of 2 people learning to live together. Renee left the firm when their daughter Chloe was born because the hours didn't line up with what a newborn needed, and because Marcus earned enough for the 2 of them to live comfortably on his income alone. She planned to go back to work when Chloe turned 3, then 5, then when Chloe started elementary school, then when things were a little more settled. Things always eventually settled. Going back to work never did. Not because Marcus ever forbade it, that would have been easier to see and easier to name, but because of the way life in that house had quietly organized itself so that Renee's return to work was always the thing that could wait, the thing that wasn't urgent, the thing to figure out later. Marcus never once said, "Don't work." He simply never made room for it to be possible. Over the years, without quite noticing, Renee kept shrinking the borders of what she considered hers. First the job, then the friends she used to go out with, who slowly drifted to the edges of a life that had reorganized itself entirely around everyone else's needs. Then the opinions which she voiced less and less often, because Marcus had a way of listening to them that made them sound naive, and it's hard to keep offering opinions when the answer is always some version of, "That's not really how it works." There was no single date on which Renee stopped being herself. It happened the way most important things happen gradually, without anyone ever announcing it out loud. But there was a date when she noticed. It was a Tuesday in March, 8 months before that night in the study. Chloe was 10, and she came home from school that day with a drawing from art class. It was a family portrait. Marcus stood in the center, holding a rolled-up blueprint. Chloe stood beside him, smiling, and Renee stood on the other side of the page. By the stove. Just that. Not a job, not a briefcase, nothing that said anything at all about who she was. Just the stove. Renee taped the drawing to the fridge with a magnet the way she always did with Chloe's artwork. She thanked her daughter, she made dinner, washed the dishes, and went to bed before Marcus got home, who said later he'd had back-to-back meetings. But that night, lying in the dark, waiting for sleep that wouldn't come, she kept thinking about the drawing. About the stove. About the 10 years since she'd left the firm, 10 years that her own daughter had just summed up without meaning to as a kitchen appliance. It wasn't a dramatic thought. It wasn't some cinematic moment of clarity. It was simpler than that, and worse. When did I become only that? And underneath that question, another one. When did I stop being anything else? What Renee did over the following 8 months, almost nobody knew. Almost. Her friend Denise knew, who still lived back in Asheville, and who Renee had called every week for 15 years. Thursdays at first, then Wednesdays, once Thursdays got complicated with the week's logistics. Denise taught middle school. She had 3 kids and a husband she loved with the plain, uncomplicated honesty of someone who had never once lost herself in the act of loving somebody else. "I think I have to do something," Renee told Denise on a call in March. "I don't know exactly what yet, but something. About Marcus, about me, something about me." Denise knew her well enough to hear that this was different. "What do you need?" "Time, think, and someone who'll just listen without trying to fix it." "That's what I'm here for." That call ran 2 hours. It was the first time in longer than she could remember that Renee had talked about herself. Not about Chloe, not about Marcus's firm, not about the house or the vacations or whose calendar needed managing. About what she felt, what she wanted. What she'd quietly stopped wanting because wanting things had a way of complicating everything. When she hung up, Renee walked down the hall to check on Chloe, who was sleeping with the specific, untroubled stillness of a kid who doesn't yet have any reason to sleep badly. She watched her for a moment, then went to the kitchen, made a cup of tea, sat down at the table, and opened the banking app on her phone. Not the household account she checked every week. Her own account, the one that had been hers since before the wedding, the one she'd let quietly go dormant over the years as the household expenses funneled through Marcus's card instead. The balance wasn't impressive. It was what remained of her old savings from the firm, plus whatever she'd managed to set aside now and then from the grocery money. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The second thing she did was call a lawyer. Patricia Foster was a family law attorney in Atlanta, recommended by a coworker of Denise's who'd gone through a separation a couple of years earlier. Renee called her on a Thursday, and they met the following Monday at 11 in the morning at Patricia's office in Midtown. "Are you thinking about separating?" Patricia asked right at the start. "I'm thinking about understanding my options," Renee said. "That's not the same thing." Patricia gave her a small, knowing smile. "Fair enough, it's different," and she walked Renee through it. Renee left that office with a notebook full of notes and a mind that felt, for the first time in a while, in order. What was in those notes included her rights in a 14-year marriage under Georgia's equitable division laws, the assets that had accumulated during the marriage, and what she was legally owed, the divorce process and its timeline, and something Patricia mentioned almost as an afterthought near the end of the meeting. You have a college degree. You're a CPA. Is your license still active? I think so, Renee said. I never let it lapse. Good, Patricia made a note. If this goes the way I think it will, that's going to matter. Renee didn't ask anything further in the moment, but she filed the information away. The third thing was more personal and harder than everything before it. Renee flew back to Asheville not with the excuse of visiting her mother, though she did that too, but with the specific purpose of walking through the places she'd known before she became Marcus Reed's wife to see whether she still recognized any piece of herself in them. She walked through the old downtown square, which looked the same even though she wasn't. She went to the farmer's market where her mother used to buy fabric for her sewing jobs, which still smelled the way it always had, new cloth and coffee from the corner stand. She walked onto the campus where she'd studied and stood in the quad for a long moment, looking at the buildings, remembering the 21-year-old who had walked those same paths, certain that the future was a territory she was allowed to design herself. That young woman still existed somewhere. Nobody had asked her anything in a very long time. Miss Pearl welcomed her the way she always did, with enough food for twice as many people and no questions she hadn't been invited to ask. But on the second night, sitting out on the porch after dinner, the warm North Carolina evening settling around them, Miss Pearl finally spoke. What's going on, baby? I don't know yet. Is it Marcus? It's me too. A pause. I think I lost myself. Not all at once, slowly. Miss Pearl was quiet for a moment. Then she asked something that caught Renee off guard. And is there a cure for that? For losing yourself? Renee thought about it. Maybe, but it takes doing things that scare you. Everything worth doing does, Miss Pearl sipped her coffee. Your great-grandmother ran that farm out past Hendersonville by herself for 20 years after your great-grandfather passed. She was 43, never run a single thing on her own before that. First year was awful. Second year was hard. From the third year on, it was the best years of her life. Renee looked at her mother. Are you telling me to get divorced? I'm telling you that if you're going to do something hard, remember where you come from. Miss Pearl held her gaze. The women in this family don't stay in places where they go invisible. Renee didn't answer, but she kept that sentence in the same place she kept everything that mattered. Back in Atlanta, Renee did the fourth thing. She renewed her CPA license, which had never technically lapsed but needed updating, and got it handled within a week. Then, she reached out to 3 accounting firms around the city, not to ask for a job outright, but to test the water, to understand what the market looked like now, what had changed in 10 years, and what hadn't. 2 of the 3 firms wrote back with interest. One invited her in for an informal conversation, which she attended on a Tuesday, dropping Chloe off at the after-school sitters beforehand. The meeting ran 40 minutes. The firm's founder, a man in his late 50s who'd started the practice 20 years earlier, asked about her background, about the years she'd spent out of the workforce, about what she was hoping to find. 10 years is a long time, he said, not unkindly but directly. It is, Renee said, and in those 10 years I ran the finances of a household. I managed the books for an architecture firm. I handled investments that weren't even in my name because nobody else was going to. A pause. Accounting doesn't go anywhere, neither does the habit of doing it well. He looked at her for a moment. Why come back now? Because now I have clear reasons to. She left that meeting with no promises, but with the certainty that she had sat in that room as someone who knew her own worth, not someone asking permission to have any. It was during those same months that Renee also started noticing what she'd been choosing not to notice about Marcus. She didn't go looking for proof. She didn't check his phone. She didn't hire anyone. She simply stopped putting in the quiet effort it took not to see what was already there to be seen. Marcus was staying late more often than work alone could explain. Small habits had shifted gradually. The phone kept closer. Certain questions met with evasive answers that used to open into real conversations and now closed with a single word. A different energy on certain days. the specific kind of energy people carry when part of their life is going well, and it throws the rest into contrast. Renee didn't confront any of it, not yet. Not because she lacked the nerve, but because she needed to know what she wanted first, independent of whatever Marcus was doing. That was the real difference between the Renee of 14 years ago and the Renee she was becoming. This decision wasn't going to be about him. It was going to be about her. It was somewhere in that process of watching and deciding that Renee took the fifth step. She went back to Patricia Foster's office. "I want to start the process," she said. Patricia looked at her. "Have you talked to your husband yet?" "Not yet." A pause. "I want everything in order before I have that conversation." "Why?" "Because if I talk to him first, he'll think he can manage the conversation. I want it so that by the time we have it, there's nothing left for him to manage." Patricia wrote something down. "When do you want to move forward?" "As soon as possible." She signed the first papers that afternoon. The process took weeks, the way these things do when they're done properly, with legal timelines to respect and documents to gather and verifications to complete. Renee handled all of it with the same calm efficiency she'd spent years quietly applying to the numbers of a household and a firm work that had never once been recognized as the work it actually was. Marcus told her about the other woman on a Tuesday in November. He did it in the study at 9 at night after Chloe was already asleep. He'd chosen the study because it was the most neutral room in the house, without the emotional weight of the bedroom or the daily rhythm of the kitchen. He'd rehearsed what he wanted to say. He had a direct version and a gentler, more gradual version, and he'd settled on direct because Renee had always valued directness, even when he hadn't always practiced it himself. He told her the woman's name was Melissa, that she was a partner at a friend's firm, that it hadn't been planned, these things never are, that it had been going on for several months, and that he didn't want Renee finding out from anyone else. He told her the marriage had stopped working a while ago, which was true, though the two of them had entirely different ideas about what that truth actually meant. He said maybe it was better for both of them to go their separate ways, that he wanted the best for her, and for Chloe that he hoped they could handle it like adults. And then he waited. He waited for her to cry, to ask how long it had been going on, to say she'd suspected something, to ask for more details, to tell him she still loved him and wanted to try, or to accuse him of something, anything, any of the things people do when they get news like that. Anything that would confirm he was still the center that his wife's whole life turned around. Renee said, "Okay, that's fine," and went to bed. The next morning she got up at her usual time, made Chloe's breakfast, drove her to school, came home. Marcus was still in bed when she left the house. When she came back, he was in the study with a cup of coffee he'd made himself, which he rarely did. "Can we talk?" he asked when he saw her. "Sure." Renee sat down in the same chair she'd listened from the night before. "What do you want to talk about?" Marcus looked at her. He'd expected her to look different somehow, visibly affected. She looked exactly like she always did. "Are you okay?" "Yes." "You don't have any questions?" "I don't have any questions I can't answer myself." Renee folded her hands in her lap. "What I do want to talk about is next steps." Marcus frowned. "What do you mean?" "The divorce." She said it without any drama, the same tone she'd have used to talk about the week's schedule or the grocery budget. "We need to talk about custody arrangements for Chloe, the house, and what I'm owed." Marcus stared at her for a moment. He had expected a lot of things from this conversation. He had not expected this. "You're already thinking about divorce?" "I already started it." Renee opened the bag she'd brought with her and pulled out a folder. "Patricia Foster has been advising me. I signed the first papers 3 weeks ago." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the night before's. Marcus looked at the folder, then at Renee. 3 weeks ago. "Yes, before I even knew about your side of things." Marcus opened his mouth and closed it again. It was the first time in 14 years Renee had seen that particular expression on his face. The look of someone realizing the situation was not what he thought it was. "When did you decide this?" "A while ago. I couldn't tell you exactly when until I could." "Why didn't you say anything For the same reason you didn't tell me about Melissa until it was convenient for you to. She said it without accusation, more like an observation about the mechanics of what had happened between them. People act when they're ready to act. Marcus kept staring at the folder. Do you know what's in that? I've read every page twice. A pause. I'm a CPA, Marcus. I know how to read a contract. What followed was a process that took months, but one Renee had prepared for with such thoroughness that there were rarely any surprises. The house was the most complicated point, both because it was the biggest asset and because Chloe still lived there. Renee's proposal, one that Patricia considered solid from the start, was that she and Chloe would stay in the house until Chloe finished elementary school, with Marcus paying agreed-upon support during that time, and that at the end of that period, the house would be sold and the proceeds split fairly. Marcus, who had walked into that first formal meeting with his own attorney expecting a fight, found instead a clear, well-supported proposal where every point had its own legal and practical justification. There was no emotion in the paperwork, just numbers, dates, and terms. Your wife came very prepared, his attorney told him privately. She always was, Marcus said, and there was something more complicated than it sounded sitting underneath that answer. Custody of Chloe mattered most to Renee, and she spent the most time negotiating it. She wanted real shared custody, not custody on paper, wanted Marcus actively present in his daughter's life, not visiting whenever it happened to be convenient. She wrote in specific terms about scheduling responsibilities and joint decision-making on health and education. Why do you push so hard for me to be involved? Marcus asked in one of those meetings. Because Chloe needs you, Renee said. And because I refuse to be the reason she grows up thinking her father didn't want to be there. Marcus didn't answer right away. Then he said, she might grow up thinking I'm the villain of this story anyway. If you treat her right, she won't. Renee looked at him. And if you treat her wrong, you'll have earned it. It was the longest and the most honest conversation they'd had in years. Chloe found out her parents were separating on a December afternoon when Renee picked her up from school and, instead of driving home, took her to the little cafe downtown that made the thick, hot chocolate Chloe loved. Is something wrong, Mom? Chloe asked before Renee had said a word. Yes. Renee set the hot chocolate in front of her. I need to tell you something important. Chloe was 10 with the watchful eyes kids develop when they've spent their whole lives paying close attention to adults, because somewhere inside, they already know adults are more complicated than they let on. She listened to her mother explain that she and her dad had decided to live apart, that the two of them would stay in the house until she finished elementary school, that her dad was still going to be her dad, and that both of those things could be true at once. That her parents no longer living together didn't mean either one loved her any less. Chloe took it all in. Then she asked, And you, Mom? Are you okay? Renee looked at her. It was the same question Chloe always asked when something seemed off, that specific ability kids have to notice their mother's emotional state before their mother has even put words to it herself. I'm scared and I'm okay, both at the same time, Renee said with the honesty her daughter deserved. That makes sense, Chloe thought it over. Like when I have to present something at school that's scary, but part of me still wants to do it. Exactly like that. Chloe took a sip of her hot chocolate. Okay. A pause. Can I still go visit Grandma Pearl in Asheville every summer? Yes. And is Dad going to come to my school plays? I'm going to make sure he knows he has to. Chloe nodded, satisfied. Then okay. Marcus moved into a rented apartment over in Decatur that January. The move happened on a Saturday while Chloe was staying with Miss Pearl, who'd come up from Asheville specifically to be there with her granddaughter that weekend. Renee stayed home while Marcus packed his things. Not to keep an eye on him, but because it was still her house and she had no reason not to be there. It was a calm move. Marcus took what was his left, what was shared, and asked when there was any doubt. Renee answered with the same steadiness she'd had all along. When Marcus finished and was standing at the door with the last box, he paused. Can I ask you something? When did you actually know you wanted this? Not the legal process, the real moment. Renee thought about it. The day Chloe brought home a drawing from school. Marcus frowned. A drawing, a family drawing. You with your blueprints, her smiling. A pause. Me next to the stove. Marcus watched her. Renee could see him trying to understand what could possibly matter about a kid's drawing. And it hit me that my own daughter, when she thought about me, thought of a kitchen appliance. Renee said it without bitterness, like a fact. And I realized she wasn't wrong. That's what I'd let myself become. Marcus set the box down on the floor and looked at her in a way he hadn't looked at her in a long time, with real attention. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know." "I didn't realize," he stopped. "No," Renee said gently, "you didn't. And I didn't notice when I started accepting it either. We both have something to learn from this." Marcus picked the box back up and left. Renee shut the door and stood in the living room for a moment, listening to the quiet of the house without him in it. It was a different quiet than before. Wider. More hers. The accounting firm that had interviewed Renee called in February. "We remember our conversation from a few months back," the office manager said. "Are you still interested?" "Yes," Renee said. "When can I start?" She went in the following Tuesday. This time, it was a more formal meeting, including a technical assessment she finished in 40 minutes when they'd given her an hour. The founder reviewed her answers, looked up at her, and said, "Start Monday." That weekend, Renee went shopping for work clothes. Not much, just what she needed. She went to a shop in Buckhead she'd never bought from before because Marcus had always had opinions about brands and stores, and it had simply been easier not to have that conversation. She chose things on her own, tried on what she liked, bought what fit well. It was the simplest and somehow most meaningful shopping trip of her adult life. Monday morning, she arrived at the office at 8:50. The receptionist walked her to the office she'd be using, a small space with a window overlooking a courtyard, a computer, a plain, functional lightwood desk. Renee set her bag down on the chair, sat, turned on the computer. She was 43 years old, and she hadn't worked a formal job in a decade. Her first client's analysis was due Thursday. She got to work. Denise called that first Monday night. "How'd it go?" "Good," Renee smiled, even though Denise couldn't see it. "Different than I remembered. Better than I expected. And Chloe, is she doing okay?" "She went to her dad's this weekend and came back telling me all about the park and a book he bought her that she'd been wanting." "And how'd that sit with you?" "Good." "Really?" She meant it. "Being a good dad doesn't make him a good husband, and it doesn't mean our marriage had a fix. Those are separate things." Denise was quiet for a second. "You sound different, Renee." "Different how?" "Like when you were 25, fresh off the plane in Atlanta with 2 suitcases and your cousin's address." A pause. "Like someone who knows where she's headed." Renee thought about it. "I think that's it." A pause. "Took me a while to know it, but yeah, I think I know where I'm going." Chloe adjusted better than Renee had expected, which tends to happen when the adults involved genuinely work at keeping their own problems from becoming the whole family's problem. Marcus showed up to every school play. He was on time for every handoff. He called Chloe on the days that weren't his not to push, but because he found he missed talking to her more than he'd expected before he had to live without seeing her every day. On one of those calls, Chloe asked what he was doing. "At the office," Marcus said. "Looking over some drawings. There's a deadline in the morning." Chloe took that in. "Do you miss the house?" Marcus took a moment. "Yeah." "Do you miss Mom too? And why'd you do what you did?" It was the blunt question adults tend to avoid, the kind kids ask because they haven't yet learned how to dodge it. Marcus considered it honestly. "Because I was selfish," he said, "and because I didn't know how to take care of what I had until I'd already lost it." "Did you learn?" "I hope so, at least enough to be a better dad." Chloe thought it over. "Okay, you can come to my soccer game Saturday. I'll be there. Can you bring the chocolate milk from the corner store? Mom says it's not very healthy, but I like it." Marcus laughed. It was the first laugh Renee had she heard it would have recognized as the real thing, the one from before. Chocolate milk will be there. 6 months after the divorce was final, Renee took Chloe back to Asheville, not to escape anything, but because she wanted her daughter to really know the places that had shaped her, places Chloe had visited but never truly seen with the attention those kinds of places deserve. They stayed a week. They visited Miss Pearl, who taught Chloe how to work the second-hand sewing machine, still running decades after she'd bought it. Chloe learned to sew a straight seam in half an hour and was so proud of the result that she folded the scrap of fabric into her backpack to take back to Atlanta. They walked the downtown square, the farmers market, the college campus. Renee told Chloe about the 21-year-old who had once walked those same paths, certain she could design her own future. "Can you still do that?" Chloe asked. "Yes." Renee looked at her. "Sometimes you forget you can, though, and you need reminding." "And now you remember." "Yes." A pause. "You know you can, too." Chloe thought it over with the seriousness only a 10-year-old can manage. "I think so, but sometimes I don't know how." "That's okay." Renee put a hand on her shoulder. "You don't always have to know how. You just have to know that you can." Chloe seemed satisfied and kept walking. Renee watched her daughter cross the quad and thought about the drawing of the stove, about the young woman she'd been, and the woman she'd found her way back to being. She thought about Denise and her mother and Patricia Foster and the founder who had told her, "Start Monday," about every quiet, small step that had carried her from that Tuesday in March when she saw the drawing to this college quad in Asheville 9 months later, watching her daughter walk with the confidence of someone who doesn't know everything yet, but who has someone watching her who believes she can. That was enough. More than enough. Marcus, in those same months, learned the things people learn when the life they'd assumed was permanent turns out not to be. He learned that a 2-bedroom apartment can feel emptier than a house he'd never noticed was full because Renee had been the one filling it. He learned that the practical parts of life, the parts that had always just worked, take real time and attention and don't sort themselves out. He learned to cook 3 basic meals because the rest required practice he hadn't put in yet, and he learned slowly, with the particular resistance men carry when they've spent years mistaking competence at work for competence at life, that the person who had seen him most clearly all along had been Renee. Not the successful Marcus from the firm, not the Marcus who knew how to work a room at a dinner party, but the real one, with his misplaced certainties and his easy arrogance and his habit of not seeing what was right in front of him. That was what he'd lost. Not a wife who admired him, but a person who actually knew him, and who right up to the last moment had kept choosing to be honest about what she saw. He started going to therapy, not urgently, not with the conviction that a few sessions would fix everything, but with the slow willingness of someone who has finally understood that some things you learn alone, and some things you learn with help, and that confusing the two comes with a cost that isn't always immediate, but always eventually arrives. In one session, his therapist asked what the most honest memory of his marriage was. Marcus thought for a while. "Once," he said, "Renee put together a dinner party for my business partners. Spent weeks on it. The menu, the decorations, every detail. It was perfect. My partners talked about that dinner for months afterward." A pause. "I never told her it was perfect. I just assumed she knew, and she probably did." A pause. "But maybe it would have been worth saying. Why didn't you?" Marcus took a long time to answer. "Because I assumed whatever it meant to me, it meant the same thing to her. And I never once asked if that true." The session ended in silence. The therapist didn't push for more. Sometimes the answers that matter don't need any follow-up. The first anniversary of the divorce fell on a Friday. Renee didn't mark it on the calendar. It wasn't the kind of date that needed marking or celebrating. It was simply a date, one among many in a year that had been more complicated and more honest than the 14 that came before it. That Friday night, once Chloe was asleep, Renee went to the living room, poured herself a glass of red wine, and sat down in the chair where a year earlier she'd listened to Marcus tell her there was someone else. She looked around the room. It looked different than it had when Marcus lived there. Not dramatically so. Most of the furniture was still the same, most of the decor too, but there were new details Renee had added since the house had become entirely hers. A plant in the corner that Marcus would have said took up too much space. A painting she'd bought from a local artist market because she liked the color one Marcus would have called too casual for that wall. Small things, but hers. She drank the wine slowly. She thought about the afternoon she'd signed the first papers with Patricia Foster, about the mix of fear and clarity she'd felt in that moment, a combination she'd never felt at the same time before, about walking out of that office onto the midtown street, with the afternoon sun hitting hard, thinking, there it is, it's started. She thought about Chloe sewing on her grandmother's machine in Asheville, so proud of that straight seam she'd tucked the fabric scrap into her backpack. She thought about that Monday morning, walking into the office at 8:50, turning on the computer, and getting to work like she'd never stopped, because in every way that mattered, she hadn't. She'd only been waiting. She thought about the drawing of the stove still taped to the fridge, even though newer drawings had gone up over it, since ones that showed Chloe at school with her friends, with her mom, yes, still in the kitchen sometimes, but also at the office with her work bag. Same braid as always, but a different expression, one that Chloe, the way kids sometimes do, had somehow managed to capture with a 10-year-old's crayon. Not just the stove anymore. That was something too. Thank you, she thought, without knowing exactly who or what she was thanking. The drawing, maybe. Denise. Miss Pearl and her story about the farm. Patricia Foster and her direct questions. The firm's founder and his start Monday. Chloe who, without knowing it, had asked exactly the right question at exactly the right moment. Thank you, she thought again and finished the wine. What Marcus didn't find out until much later was that on the day Renee signed the first papers with Patricia Foster, he had been in a presentation for an important corporate client. It had been one of the best presentations of his career, the client told him afterward. He'd left the building that afternoon with the kind of high that comes from work done well, a feeling Marcus often confused with something more like actual well-being. That night, he'd come home and found Renee in the kitchen making dinner. He'd been animated, walking her through every detail of the presentation. He'd opened a bottle of wine to celebrate. Renee had listened, asked questions, and all the right places raised her glass with him. At no point that evening did he know that earlier that same afternoon, while he stood in a conference room presenting blueprints, she had signed the documents that would change everything. That was what Marcus thought about months later. It was maybe the clearest picture of how the two of them had operated for 14 years. Him at the center, her quietly running everything else. The difference was that before, he hadn't noticed. Now he couldn't stop noticing. What Chloe learned that year was that the important people in your life can be going through hard things without necessarily telling you about it. And that isn't a lie, it's respect. That parents can stop living together and still both be your parents, and that those two things don't cancel each other out even when it feels like they might. That her mom knew how to sew even though she'd never once mentioned it, because she'd learned as a girl and kept it tucked away among the things a person keeps when there's never quite room to take them back out. That her great-great-grandmother's sewing machine had stitched things that outlasted plenty of newer things, and that sewing your first straight seam with your own hands on a machine that smells like oil and old fabric in the house of someone who loves you, about as completely as anyone can, is one of the most satisfying things in the world. She kept that scrap of fabric in her desk drawer underneath her school notebooks. Every time she saw it, she remembered her grandmother telling her, "Slow down, sweetheart. The things worth doing right, you do slow." What Denise said to Renee in their last call of that year was on a Thursday night in December, late cold on Denise's end in Asheville, and cold on Renee's end in Atlanta too. They'd talked about plenty that hour and a half: Renee's work, Chloe's school play, Denise's kids, Miss Pearl's health, which was holding up fine even with her years catching up to her. Near the end, in the quiet of the last few minutes before hanging up, Denise said, "Do you remember what you told me back in March? When you called that first time, you said, 'I think I have to do something. I don't know exactly what yet, but I have to do something.'" Renee remembered. Yeah, and she thought about the year behind her, the paper signed and the job found, and Chloe's crooked, proud seam, and the plant in the corner of the living room, and the wine that Friday night drunk, alone and at peace. "I did something," she said. It was the right thing. I don't know if it was the right thing. A pause. It was the honest thing. And that's always the best place to start, Denise laughed on the other end of the line, the kind of laugh that comes from finally hearing something you've been waiting a long time to hear. There she is, she said, the Renee I knew in college. She never left. Renee smiled. She was just waiting. Waiting for what? The right moment to come back to herself. They hung up. Renee sat there for a moment, phone still in her hand, looking around a living room that was entirely hers now, the plant in the corner, the too casual painting on the wall, the quiet, easy silence of a house where sleep came easily. She set the phone down on the table, turned off the light, went upstairs, and slept well, the way she'd been sleeping for months now, the way she planned on sleeping for a long time to come. If this story stayed with you, if some part of you recognized Renee in a moment you've lived through yourself, or if you've ever been Marcus, understanding something a little too late, tell us in the comments what part of this story stayed with you the most. If you enjoyed this one, hit follow so you don't miss the next story. Because there's a kind of courage that doesn't make noise. It doesn't need an audience. It builds itself slowly, one quiet step at a time, with the patience of someone who knows that the things worth doing take time, and that time used well always leads somewhere. Sometimes that somewhere is exactly where you were always meant to be. Thanks for listening. We'll see you in the next story.